All right, welcome back. So our first session was amazing, but we're going to keep things rolling right into our next panel on Forgotten Heroes, featuring Dr. Jeffrey Sammons as chair, Major General Peter Gravett, and our Institute's own fellow, Dr. Cameron McCoy. Peter and Cameron will present today on another underrepresented story in World War II. Today, General Gravett will present on one of the chapters of his new book, Battling While Black, about African Americans who served under General George S. Patton. And while Cameron will provide an overview of African American Marines as featured in his book, Contested Valor, African American Marines in an Age of Power, Protest, and Tokenism, released this past November. Our chair, Dr. Jeffrey T. Sammons, is Professor Emeritus of History at New York University. His first book, Beyond the Ring, The Role of Boxing in American Society. He's also the co-author of Harlem's Rattlers in the Great War, The Undaunted 369th Regiment, and The African American Quest for Equality. He recently also contributed to The Fight for Things Which We Die, about African Americans in the Great War, in Imagined Fronts, The Great War and Global Media. He was a history advisor to the U.S. World War I Centennial Commission and a founding member of its Valor Medal Review Task Force. Jeff currently serves as the Medal of Honor Museum Scholarly Advisory Panel. So with that impressive panel, though, and on that, Jeff, we're going to hand it off to you. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, Dr. Bell, and thank those of you in the audience, and especially my good friend Nick Muller, whose association with me led to my being here today. I'm going to give a little more time than others have given to the biographies of the presenters today, because their biographies are important to their scholarship, integral. We couldn't understand the scholarship without understanding who they are. Both gentlemen are the personification of the American dream through military service and higher education. Yet both know, and their books show, that those upon whose shoulders they stand had a much more difficult struggle than they. Peter Gravett comes from a large, impoverished family, and inspired by his father's service, saw a military career and later law enforcement as a means to a better and productive life. And Peter would go on to combine the two, serving in the National Guard at the same time as the police force in Los Angeles. From an enlisted man in the segregated California National Guard to OCS, Officer Candidate Training School, to extended service in the Army, Peter became the first African American to command a National Guard division in the entire history of the United States military. And I think that that deserves a round of applause. Peter served numerous tours of duty in Europe and Asia, and more recently served as a senior NATO training officer in the U.S. Partnership for Peace program. And please see Peter's biography for some of his other notable accomplishments. Cameron McCoy, recognized as a young man growing up in inner city Washington, D.C., that he did not want to become another statistic, and decided he would seek a life of discipline and spirituality. For him, the path to escape was college, and OCS, and the United States Marine Corps. Today, Lieutenant Colonel McCoy is the Asness Family Foundation Fellow in the Jenny Craig Institute for the Study of War and Democracy and a resident scholar at the U.S. Naval War College, in addition to being an infantry officer in the U.S. Marine Corps Reserves. McCoy has, to his credit, multiple combat tours and deployments to Iraq, and not the least of McCoy's accomplishments is his earning a doctorate in history from the University of Texas in Austin, which has led to numerous teaching appointments at West Point, at Brigham Young University, and the Air Force Academy. To say something about the work of Peter Gravett and Cameron McCoy, Gravett's Battling While Black and McCoy's Contested Valor could not be more different in approach, style, content. Gravett's is focused on the internal dynamics of 4 African-American units in Patton's Army, the 320th Barrage Balloon Battalion, the 333rd Heavy Field Artillery Battalion, the 761st Tank Battalion, and the 6888, which is the Postal Battalion led by Major Chariot Adams. Cameron McCoy's work on the Montford Point Marines and beyond is a study that looks at the internal dynamics and the external dynamics as being in dialogue with one another. And one of the areas that I hope that Cameron will talk about today is the representation of the African-American Marine in popular culture. They might be very different in the ways that I describe, but they come to the same conclusion. And I'll let them tell you what that conclusion is. And without further ado, I introduce Major General, retired U.S. Army, Peter Gravett, and to follow will be Lieutenant Colonel Cameron McCoy. Thank you very much.
General.
Thank you, Dr. Sammons. Good morning. I want to thank the museum and library and director, staff, volunteers for the opportunity to come today and to present and talk about General Patton and some of his African-American units that supported him and were actually part of his Third Army. So what is the Third Army? A numbered army is, in the case of the Third Army, consisted of essentially 3 corps, the 8th Corps, 12th Corps, and 20th Corps. So General Patton had probably anywhere from 8 to 12 divisions under his command at any given time. And so, so let me take you back to World War I just briefly. In World War I, there were several African-American units fighting in Europe, but most of them were fighting under the leadership of French Army. They wore French uniforms, French helmets, had French helmets. So why was this? Well, not really, don't really know, but perhaps maybe the American military didn't believe that the African Americans were brave enough to fight and didn't want to be maligned as their leader. So after the war, after World War I, the Great War, when the military came home, the Army very quickly discharged most of the African Americans from the American Army. They wanted to keep the Army white, but they maintained 4 regiments in the Army, and these were cavalry regiments. The 9th and 10th Cavalry, known as the Buffalo Soldiers, a nickname given to them by the Indians, and then the 23rd and 24th Infantry Regiments. And their mission in America then was to patrol the southern border of Mexico, believing that the Germans, the remnants of the Germans, may want to invade the United States from the south, from Brazil through Mexico into the U.S. So that's why those regiments were maintained. At that time, the American Army only had about 4,000 blacks remaining in the entire Army. Only 5 officers, 3 of which were chaplains, and those chaplains were the chaplains for those 4 regiments. And the other 2 were father and son, Benjamin O. Davis Sr. and Benjamin O. Davis Jr. Benjamin Davis Sr. would become the first African-American general in the Army. His son would later rise to command the Tuskegee Airmen after having been a cavalryman. So in my book, I interchange the terms black, African-American, Negro, colored, nigger, just as those words were used back in the day. And so as the war in Europe was starting to heat up in the late 30s, America reinstituted, or was going to reinstitute the draft to bring the Army back up to speed in case we entered the war. And so there was a lot of discussion about whether or not blacks should be included in the new Army, whether they could join or whether they could be conscripted or drafted into the Army. One Southern governor said that, made a public statement that blacks should not be part of the Army. The Army should be white, and blacks had no role in founding America. Well, I guess that governor probably forgot that blacks built the White House, blacks built the Jefferson Memorial, blacks built the Washington Memorial, black Buffalo soldiers settled the West, they guarded wagon trains going west, they scouted watering holes, they fought the Indians. They forgot that the Buffalo Soldiers were the first national park stewards in the national parks as their role as a soldier. And so, I guess he didn't know that blacks had picked the cotton in the South, which drove the economy of the South for 200 years. But that being said, eventually blacks were allowed to join the Army, and some were drafted. Unfortunately, some blacks were discriminated because some blacks who wanted to join were turned down, and some that probably should have been given a deferment were drafted. And just one quick story about a person that was drafted in the Army. This person had been, he was a father, had a wife, he had 8 children. The oldest child was 10 years old. He received a draft notice and was drafted, leaving his wife with no money, no funds, no job, no telephone, no savings, not much of anything, but a lot of determination. 8 children, 10 years or younger. The oldest 4 were boys, and they scoured the neighborhood running errands for neighbors, cutting lawns, washing windows, and doing that sort of thing. That mother and father was Alice and Clarence Gravett, my parents. And those older boys were my older brothers. So that was just one example of someone being drafted that probably should have had a deferment. But anyway, so let's move on and talk about General Patton and his battalions. battalions that were part of his Third Army and those that supported his Third Army. An army is, a numbered army, as I mentioned, is 8 to 12 divisions, anywhere about 300,000 soldiers. And so as the war was heating up and soldiers were being deployed across the pond to England initially, it was determined that the invasion force would eventually need to have cover as they crossed the English Channel. Cover much as the major cities in England had used in the Blitz of 1940. And those covers were floating balloons, dirigibles, if you will, extended on a large wire cord, flown anywhere from 200 feet to several thousand feet in the air. And those cords were invisible to the German fighter planes coming in, and some of them would interdict that cable, which would be drawn up to the aircraft with a small bomb and explode and ignite the fuel tank of the aircraft, and it would crash. Well, that same type of thinking went into placing those on the invasion force that were to cross the channel eventually over to Normandy. So of the 7,000 ships, boats, watercraft, landing craft that eventually crossed the English Channel to Normandy, many of them had these balloons. And those balloons were manned by a black battalion, the 320th Barrage Balloon Battalion. Now, Hollywood got it wrong. Steven Spielberg got it wrong, although he had some poor researchers, because they always said that there were no blacks on Normandy beaches on D-Day. Well, there were over 2,000 blacks on Normandy on D-Day. 1,100 of those were in the 320th Barrage Balloon Battalion, because when those watercraft, those that made it to shore, those balloons then were transferred from the ship to shore. And they flew over Normandy for several weeks after the landing. Of course, General Patton arrived a little bit later. He wasn't there for the big day, but he made his name later on. So that's one of the units that I want to talk about in my book. Another unit is the 761st Tank Battalion, an all-black battalion. Now, even though the Army had blacks coming into the Army, there was a hue and cry that they didn't want any black combat units established. The blacks' role was to serve in support units, to support the white combat units. Well, after much hue and cry by black leaders, the black press, with support from Eleanor Roosevelt, the president's wife, and her good friend, Mary McLeod Bethune, several black combat units were organized. One was the 761st Tank Battalion. But the Army's idea was that battalion was never going to deploy to war. So several white battalions, armored battalions, were created, and they were trained initially at Camp Claiborne, Louisiana, and later on in Camp Hood, Texas. The white units were trained for 3 or 4 months and deployed into the combat zone. The 761st, which was rated the most outstanding unit in training at each evaluation period, they did not deploy. After 3 months, they didn't go. 6 months, a year, and they're watching these other white units come and deploy after 3 months. Year and a half, 2 years. They're still there training at Camp Hood. 2.5 years. Finally, with the losses of tanks in France, due to the hedgerow country, where the tanks were being destroyed by the Germans hidden in the hedgerows, General Patton and his Third Army were almost out of options. and he needed more tanks. He reached back to the U.S. for more tanks, and he said, well, there's only 2 remaining tank battalions, the 761st and another one. The other one had just been organized. They said they told him it's a black battalion. Do you want it? He said, well, I didn't ask for color, I asked for tanks. So the 761st got the call. They got the call. So they went over finally, and they made a name for themselves. So over the next 6 months, starting with late summer of 1944, all the way to the end of the war, they were engaged in severe combat with the Germans. And in the book, it follows them through Belgium, Luxembourg, France, Germany, and other places, and some engagements they were involved in. Many soldiers were killed, but they captured a lot of Germans, destroyed a lot of Germans. Their record was remarkable. After the war, it was determined that they had more successes in the short time that they were in Europe than any other battalion in the Third Army. So after the war, they were recognized, but not during the war, because even though those that were wounded received the Purple Heart, some did not receive it. If they were attached out to a white unit temporarily, more times than not, they did not receive the Purple Heart for their wounds. General Eisenhower's policy was that no black would receive an award higher than a Silver Star, no matter what the valor. And so none did, until 70 years later, after review of some of the records. Not only did the 761st receive a Distinction Unit Citation, but the Medal of Honor was issued to a soldier, and several service crosses were issued after that. Another unit in General Patton's Third Army was the 333rd Field Artillery Battalion. Now, the artillery, of course, causes more casualties on the battlefield than any other branch, including the infantry. The 333rd was periodically attached to different corps in the Third Army. The artillery battalion was a separate battalion. In other words, it was not part of a division. It was not part of a corps. It was assigned to the Army headquarters. So General Patton, as other Army commanders in lettered Army, could take a separate unit and attach it to a corps based upon the current operation. So the 333rd was attached out to several units from time to time. One such unit was the 106th Infantry Division. Now, the 106th was formed in the spring of 1944. It was made up of raw recruits, and so they trained in the U.S. For a couple of months, but they didn't finish their basic training, because by that time the word was going around that the troops would be home by Christmas. And so the Army decided to send this green battalion, if you will, over to Europe, and they would finish their basic training in country. They were attached to the 106th Division. Again, I'm sorry, they were the 106th Division. The division commander, the officers, and the soldiers had never seen combat. They were new in country. So they were part of General Patton's Third Army. And so they were assigned to an area about the Lucien Gap, just west of the Ardennes Forest, near a town called St. Vith. And this area was considered, it was called a ghost front. The ghost front because nothing was happening there. It was kind of quiet. It was very cold. Snow was knee-deep. The Germans had occupied that area before, had been driven out by the American Army back east. And so the 106th Division occupied the positions that the Germans had months before. The soldiers didn't have cold weather gear, had not been issued yet. Again, it was cold, raining, snow, sleet. And they were dispersed along a 22-mile front. Now, typically a division, Army division, has anywhere from a 5 to 7 mile front, usually 5-mile front. They were stretched 22 miles. And why was that? Well, it was the ghost front. Nothing was going to happen. No one's going to invade. The forest was right in front of them. Tanks can't come through the forest. And so that's where they were. Well, them and other units not part of the 3rd Army, matter of fact, across the entire front there. Well, you know what happened on December 6th, December 15th. And the Ghost Front took the brunt of the invasion. And I won't get into the details of D-Day, and that calls for another speaker at another time. But let me just say that that division was overrun very quickly. They were being decimated. Their guns were shot up. Tanks came through the forest. The division soldiers were surprised. The officers were surprised. Division commander eventually wanted to be relieved as what was happening. And within a couple of days, the division was decimated. Later on, it was determined that over 10,000 soldiers from that division were either killed, captured, or wounded. Well, during the melee, several soldiers from the 333rd Field Artillery, which was offering artillery support to that division, and they were, of course, overrun also, but they took off running through the snow. And after a day and a half, 11 of them met up in the forest, cold, wet, hungry, decided to just hang loose, hang back, and try not to be captured. But they knew that they had to get shelter someplace, so they started marching. And they came upon a small town. It's called Reworth, W-E-R-E-T-H. And they looked, and it was a small town, single street, row of houses on both sides. It was daylight. They were afraid to go and identify themselves as American soldiers, so they hung out and waited for nightfall. When the night was upon them, they pulled out a white handkerchief and walked up to the first house and knocked on the door and identified themselves as American soldiers and sought shelter. The family, the Langer family, took them in. The Langer family was a large family, a Catholic family, with 8 children, but some of their older boys had been sent off in hiding because the Germans were taking local boys, this was in Belgium, local boys and conscripting them into the German army. They didn't want their sons to be German army, so they sent their boys off before the Germans had even occupied that area. So the German family had baked bread, freshly baked bread, gave them hot coffee, warmed their feet, gave them some nice blankets to put around them and to try to take care of them. But wouldn't you know it, there was a knock on the door, and it was the German army. So the family wanted to hide the soldiers in the basement. The soldiers said, no, because we don't want to jeopardize you. There were several airmen already being hidden in their basement. And the soldiers didn't know that at the time. So the door was open, soldiers came in, and they arrested them, took them outside, The family heard shots in the night. They didn't go outside to investigate, but they just kept the door closed, and that was it. This was just before Christmas, as you know. So the soldiers were never heard from again. Later on in January, as the snow started to melt, one of the younger boys, left the house to go outside to take a look, and he saw a tool, what he thought was a tool, sticking up out of the snow. He went over to investigate. That tool was a black hand. He went and got his father. Father contacted the American Army, which had occupied the area by that time. This is 2 months later. They discovered 11 bodies in the snow, black soldiers. The bodies were beaten, eyes gouged out with bayonets probably, jaws broken, dismembered, fingers broken off, legs smashed in, and so on and so forth. It was never determined what German army did that, but certainly it was the army that had been in that area when those 11 soldiers came upon that house. Later on, when the boy was a man, he left. He returned back to his hometown 20-some years later. He remembered what he had sought. He decided to make a makeshift monument of a cross in that pasture right next to the house. And then over the years, that little makeshift monument became a large monument, and years later, the Army and the Belgian people had a big ceremony commemorating that site where those soldiers were murdered. Anyway, at that ceremony, well, let me just go back for a second. When the soldiers came into the house and was given the coffee and the bread, the only thing they had to give in return was some chicken chewing gum that was in their K-ration packs, and they gave the chiclets to the family. At that ceremony, some 50 or 60 years later, everyone attended the ceremony was given a pack of chiclets gum to commemorate the gum that the soldiers had given to the family. Anyway, as I wrap up here, so just take a second. The other battalion I want to talk about that supported the General Patton was the 6th AAA Central Postal Battalion. And this battalion was made up of the only African-American women who served in Europe in World War II. They started out in the Women's Army Auxiliary Corps, WAC, WAC, as the women did, and later on they were merged into the Women's Army Corps. You can read about them in the book, some of the things that they did, some great things they did. And so when they arrived in Europe, they were faced with warehouses and airplane hangars full of mail bags. They had not been delivered for a year or two, but they were able to meet the mission and get that done. So those are the 4 units that I write about. That's the 320th Barrage Balloon Battalion, 761st Tank Battalion, 333rd Field Artillery Battalion, and the 6th AAA Central Postal Directory Battalion. Thank you.
Good morning. First thing I'd like to do is just thank the leadership of the National World War II Museum and all of its sponsors for putting on this event and hosting it. Thank you very much. I'd like to also thank the staff, the volunteers, the camera crew, and everyone who put in work that's unseen for us all to enjoy this. I'd like a special thanks to the Institute for the Study of War and Democracy, headed by Dr. Mike Bell and his team with Jeremy, Connie, and formerly Stephanie. Thanks so much for always being such a big support for me as I made it through here. And so I wanted to just make sure that I thank them for this, and thanks to Dr. Sammons and General Gravett for their time and being able to be here. Before I move on, as I talk about just a few points about my book, Contested Valor, Very rarely do you have an opportunity as an author to have people in the crowd who directly influence your work. And I want to first thank someone who's not here is Dr. Leonard Moore, who was one of my co-advisors along with Dr. Jeremy Surrey, who's in the crowd. And I just want to say thanks to Leonard. I know he's not here, but Jeremy is here. And I just want to say thank you for everything that you were able to do to see this work come forward. And you know and I know that it wasn't possible without your support. So I want to thank you for your brilliance, your patience, and your mentorship throughout the time that I did that. So thank you. I also want to thank Dr. Marcus Cox, who's also here, for his friendship throughout and serving on my dissertation committee, and for friends who are here from the Naval War College. Adrian, I see you in the back, so thanks for showing up. The Montfort Point Marines were the first African-American Marines to serve in the Marine Corps, and that did not officially happen until June 1st, 1942. And one of the things that I learned in writing my book, there are a lot of stories in there, and you can get a copy right out there, and it'll explain all of them to you. But there are some takeaways for me as an author as I've grown. And there are 5 things that I learned very quickly as I've reached this point to stand in front of you today, and I appreciate your time. Number 1, the limitations of science. Number 2, religion. Number 3, an invasion into a specific space. Number 4, the term rising to the occasion for white officers who had command of black troops. And number 5, where is the Marine Corps' Colin Powell? So as I have moved forward, those are the 5 things that really stood out to me as I worked through this and also completed this work. I want to go to the first point, limitations of science. We will see, and you'll hear this more after I speak, but on this panel about the Army War College's 1925 report and study. And what that did was it ended up showing that there was a direct conflict with the smartest minds of the time and them saying that blacks were innate cowards, they had a strain of laziness and evil to them as just from being black. And so what happened was that blacks began to challenge this through their service and their leadership. Number 2, religion. A call to arms represented many things, which Dr. Cox talked about on Friday. Yeah, Thursday or Friday. He talked about these things where he shared that putting on the uniform, donning Union blue, right, also was a physical manifestation of what it meant to be a full-fledged citizen. That you could no longer call someone a second-class citizen if they had donned the uniform and fabric of the nation. And so this was almost a religion to the American public, that this is what makes America America, and if we're allowing who we perceive former slaves or freed blacks to wear that uniform, then that means they are equal to us. And again, this becomes a direct affront to science. Number 3, as blacks begin to move into the officer corps, this becomes a sacred space and is a sacred space. It's an elite. These are elite institutions, and they want to hold on to the last vestiges of what elitism is. And so the officer corps becomes really the sacred cow for much of the military, that it cannot be invaded. And so now black men, African-American men, are now invaders into a sacred space that is reserved for only the most elite. Number 4, I found that throughout my research that every time that a white officer who was commanding black troops, this phrase always was attended with him, and it was called rising to the occasion. And I found that to be so interesting, not good or bad, just very interesting, how it was always rising to the occasion to lead blacks. And I found there were some contradictions in that, because how was it rising to the occasion if everyone tried to avoid it? And most of the time they were trying to avoid having this type of duty. And so I found a lot of contradictions with that, just rising to the occasion. And then the 5th point, and the last point that I like to just bring up is I was asked this directly from a very close friend of mine named Mark. At the end, he asked me this when I'm wrapping up things at the University of Texas at Austin. And I'm not sure, I think Jeremy may have hinted at something like this, but Mark asked me directly. He said, Cameron, how many his question was, how many colon piles did the Marine Corps miss on? And again, I never thought about that ever. And the answer is we'll never know. But I do know that the Marine Corps has an opportunity in front of it now to address that and to be able to answer that question that many people have asked me over the past decade throughout my research as a graduate student and then as a professional historian. And so I don't know the answer to that. I try to address it. I do my best to address it in the conclusion of the book, Contested Valor. But that is something that I believe will just be with me for my entire life. So one of the questions you may ask is, well, what prompted you to do this work? Well, one, it came from a place of shame and just embarrassment. I was asked by a friend of mine named Bobby May. We're running on the endurance course in Quantico, Virginia, going through infantry officers course, and there are all these signposts of directions how far something is, and one of them read Montfort Point. And he's like, oh, hey, McCoy, you know all about that, don't you? I'm sitting there thinking in my head, what the hell is Montfort Point? And I say, Montfort Point? He's like, yeah, it's where the first black Marines were. And I'm like, there were first black Marines? I mean, I just had never thought about it. I immediately just felt so silly in that moment, and I couldn't shake it. And so we go on, and I just said, how could I have become a Marine and never, ever known that there was a process, that there's this actual process about letting black Marines serve, you know, especially at some of the highest wars in these critical junctures for an entire world. And that is really what really prompted the work for me. And there's a lot more that goes with it, and I'm sure we'll discuss a little bit of that today, but I wanted to just at least give you that as an appetizer before we get into the roundtable and questions. Thank you for your time.
Thank you both
well done.
for those fine presentations. And I'd like to pick up on the point that Professor McCoy raised about the Army War College report. How many know about the 1925 Army War College report? Yeah. Very few. And there's a reason for that. That it was held secret for I'm not sure when it was declassified, but it was for quite some time. This is a report that came because, I think, of the efforts of Colonel Alan Greer, who was the Chief of Staff in the 92nd Division in World War I. Although he served under General Ballou, he seemed to have been more loyal to, or at least ideologically aligned with Robert E. Lee Bullard, and the name means something. As someone from Alabama who had formed his opinions about the black soldier in the Spanish-American War. In any event, this report sort of codified the kind of informal screeds against the black soldier that had characterized Greer's assessments. And also, there's a famous letter that he wrote to a senator in which he indicated or stated that the black soldier was only a danger to himself and to women and children, was a rank coward, and that black officers were especially poor in terms of trustworthiness, et cetera. Needless to say that this report had, back up a second, Bullard actually published these kinds of ideas or opinions in newspaper series that actually became a memoir. But the 1925 Army War College report would actually be a blueprint for the treatment of the black soldier going forward. And we know that blacks were virtually eliminated from combat duty going up to World War II, and it took the efforts of black civil rights activists to finally force the military to actually reinstitute the 92nd Division. You gentlemen have anything to say about the Army War College report?
That report was really damaging to the thoughts of future World War II generals. 1925, the war came along just 15, 16 years later, and we don't know if the future generals had seen the report. Perhaps some did, perhaps some did not. But the World War II generals, if they saw it, they would have been greatly influenced by that report. I'm talking about, all the generals: Eisenhower, Marshall, Patton, Bradley, Clark, Giroux, Haslip, others: Ridgway, Smith, Hodges, Simpson, Truscott, and you can go on and name another dozen or so generals. Had they seen that report, when the blacks came into the war, they were already biased by what they had seen in the report. And as Dr. McCoy mentioned, they had maligned the blacks before they'd even led them in combat, because they didn't lead them in combat in World War I, because most of them were junior officers, and besides that, the American Army put them under command of the French. And
the report cast, although in 1925 it was created, it casted a long shadow that, went way beyond the Korean War. But the Korean War is a salient feature in what this report really did, because it still stained the legacy of the 24th Infantry and the Army, even in Korea. And they were still saddled with this view of that they were cowardly, so much so to the point that in the Korean War that they were viewed as cowards, that they have retreated, and that no other unit, Marine Corps, Army, no one else had retreated. This was the only unit that had retreated. And so they received that backlash, which was false. It was a false report, but it was highly influenced by the 1925 Army War College study. And so these were the remnants and the gifts, the everlasting gifts of it. Up until, I would argue, the Vietnam War. And then because of the way the face of war changed more to irregular and insurgency, it completely changed how everyone would approach warfare.
Yes. General Gravett mentioned the 24th and 25th Infantry and the 9th and 10th Cavalry, and I think that we should also discuss that, because these are created during or right after the Civil War in 1866. So this is when the segregated army is basically codified, institutionalized. I think it was supposed to be a favor, a recognition, a reward for the service that black soldiers had given in the Civil War. But according to a white West Point graduate, Alabaman, Captain Matthew Steele, this was the only legislation in the federal statutes that actually discriminated against blacks. And yesterday, the issue of how blacks came to be in segregated units was raised and not fully answered, but it's because of that legislation, which he called sort of the greatest example of Jim Crow, and that blacks could ride in that segregated car or none at all. And of course, we also know what happened to the 24th Regiment, which was stationed at Camp Logan and Houston, and one of the biggest race riots in the nation in 1917 occurred because of the mistreatment of the soldiers by the community and the police force in Houston. The 25th has an incident known as the Brownsville riot in 1906, and Teddy Roosevelt actually dismissed an entire company in a rather, sham trial. So the black units were established, but also had all kinds of difficulties. I wanted to get to a bigger question. What would you say should be a major takeaway, and this is for both of you, from your books and the presentation? What is the message that you want to convey to your audience?
I think the message I want to portray is that black history is American history. This is American history. And so when we talk about what happened back 100 years ago, whether it's happened in the military or happened in civilian life, such as a city, a black town being burned in Oklahoma, or discrimination in the Army, Marine Corps, the air services. It happened. There are some people that probably were not aware that it happened. Not that they denied, they just didn't know. I would hope that some of you audience here today, if you, and I'm not pushing my book, but if you read it, you will learn something about the black soldier and how they were discriminated against, mainly by this Bible, as they called it, the study, the 1925 study by the War College, and the comments made in that study by white officers who had never commanded black soldiers, but yet they maligned them, as Dr. McCoy mentioned, as being incompetent, lazy, sleazy, criminals. Their brain was smaller than the white brain by ounces. How they measured that, I don't know. They killed somebody to find out. I'm not sure. But the takeaway for me is that this is history. And not that you need to go and preach this, it's just that for your own edification, that you know that there was issues in the Army going back 100 years, but look how far we've come. Look at the three of us sitting on the stage here. Are we fortunate? We live in the American dream. America's a great country. Love this country. 8 of my 9 brothers served in the Army. My father's in World War II in a Tuskegee Air Unit. As a private, he was in base operations. I dare say that his experience in World War II led him to be as patriotic as any white soldier would be. So that's my takeaway.
For me, the legacy of both our works endures today. My biggest takeaway was that the more that I learned, the more I realized how much I didn't know. And for me, that is revealing, it's humbling to realize I'm learning more and more and more and realizing how much I don't know. But you realize that the legacy endures. It has morphed, it is transformed in different ways, and how it is packaged and deployed within our society. But like the general said, it would say we are in a much better place. And I don't want to conflate better and good when I mention this. So I've learned what's better, what's good. And the last thing that I would take away from what our works have revealed is at the end of each war, if you wanted to minimize the number of black men in the service, like, to what end? And I always kept asking myself this question at the end of World War II, at the end of the Korean War, and at the end of Vietnam. What was this supposed to serve? So if you didn't want blacks in, but then you let them in, you say this is not an area of social experimentation. How does this serve you? And I think that's one of the things. How does it serve the military to continue to prevent or collapse or contract the space in which blacks could thrive? And they are thriving, but it's in a very controlled space and limited.
Very important points by both of you. And this will be the last comment that I make, and we should open up for questions and answers. But it's amazing to me how much the military was actually willing to suffer inefficiency, ineffectiveness, in order to maintain the racial status quo outside of the military. And they didn't want blacks to succeed because they feared that success would lead to demands and actually justification for citizenship, equality, et cetera. So the military was working hand in glove with those who would, inhibit the progress of black people. Questions?
Ladies and gentlemen, a round of applause for the panel first. Thank you, gentlemen. We're going to start to your right, all the way towards the back, please.
Thank you, gentlemen, for your study. I was in the military 34 years ago, and I was in the military police corps, which is even worse for women at that time. And the frustrations that I felt during that period of time, I can't imagine what the people that you have written about, the challenges they faced, the frustrations they faced. My question is, was there ever another study, a document, anything that the War College did to refute the 1925 report?
Not to my knowledge. I haven't found anything with that. But what it did do was it opened space, and I can only speak to the Marine Corps, it opened space for the Marine Corps to create its own document, which was Letter of Instruction 421 in 1943, which was comprised of 9 paragraphs. And essentially, it was a direct lift from the 1925 report to these 9 paragraphs to understand what the comportment of black should be, and it really gave a blank check to white commanders to treat blacks in a space that really was paternalistic.
I don't know of any either.
Next question is going to be to your left towards the front with Connie, please.
Thank you, gentlemen. That was a great presentation. I have 2 questions, one for General Gravett and then maybe one for Dr. McCoy. How much in your book is discussed the fate of the 6888, and especially the fact that they paid the ultimate sacrifice because the 3 women out of 4 at the American Cemetery, I think, are from this unit. So that's the question for you, General Gravett. How much do you want to discuss that, and how much do you want to publicize about this?
I didn't understand the question.
You didn't understand the question? In the American Cemetery of Normandy, there are 3 out of 4 women that I think were from this 6888 unit.
Something about the 6888.
So they have been recognized. They are recognized in a way that is deeper, I think, because out of 9,000 plus graves there, 148 are black military personnel, and 3 of them are women. And my question is about, very interesting to learn about the 1925 report to Dr. McCoy. How was it decided, and how much of the World War I experience in the French army influenced the US military commanders, advisors to push this in their agenda? Thank you very much.
Do you want me to go?
Are you referring to the 1925 report that
Please,
pushed the agenda?
Go ahead.
So I'll go. So the agenda was already established by Generals Ely and General Brown and company. They had already established what this report would do. They had outlined all the wars, all the way back to early periods from the late 1800s, all the way through World War I. And what it did was it was progressively worse and worse. It was essentially just to solidify, this is our research, this is our science, and this is how we backed it up. So their agenda was to prove that it doesn't matter, blacks always need to be commanded and led by whites. They cannot function, they cannot lead on their own, because that will lead to destruction, it will lead to cowardice, or at least it would project cowardice. And so that was the agenda, to always demonstrate that whites had to be in charge, whites had to command blacks.
Other questions?
Next question is going to be to your left, all the way in the back, please.
Hi. As historians, as you notice now, basically African American history is under attack. There's all kind of movements to say it's not important, it's being removed. And sort of like Dr. McCoy, I had a revelation about World War II when I started doing research, and I realized how many and how much the African American participation meant, how much it was. And with this history being under attack now, how concerned are you about the future of this information being given to kids, them understanding that, yes, African Americans did participate in this war? Because I have found, based on pretty much 100% of the people that I asked had no idea that African Americans did anything in the war other than service stewards.
One of the things that I made this connection on Thursday, and it was Dr. Suri who said it. I would treat the military as an immigration experiment, like I would apply an immigration policy to it. All right, think about all the talent that Dr. Suri talked about that the United States will develop, and yet it doesn't have a return on investment. And so I would look at it the same way. It's just, there's an opportunity to have a huge return on investment of sharing this information and maybe motivating and showing, hey, look, you have historical antecedents who are there, who've been there for you and have demonstrated this. We have Major General Gravett here as one of those. I don't think people understand how rare it is. I can count on probably maybe one hand and a half how many black generals I've met, period, just black generals that I've seen with my own eyes. I remember when I pinned on Lieutenant Colonel, I was the second Lieutenant Colonel I'd ever seen with my own eyes, black Lieutenant Colonel in the Marine Corps. When I pinned it on, I was only the second. 16 years. I was the second one to see myself. And so that history is what's important because, and I have a funny story about that as well. I'm working down at Southcom, get in an elevator, a buddy of mine's an 04 in the Navy, a lieutenant commander. And he said, why is everybody treating you like this, McCoy? And I said, well, you have to understand that guys just don't see a lot of black infantry officers, not just lieutenant colonels. So we get in the elevator, there's a Marine sergeant in there, and I just turned to him and said, I think his name was Campbell. I said, hey, Campbell, can you tell me how many black infantry lieutenant colonels you've ever met? And he says, do you mean that I've seen with my own eyes? And my buddy Jason says next to me, he's like, okay, never mind, got it. But I think we can look at it as somewhat of immigration and looking at blacks as immigrants to an extent, that the talent that they have is really important to this pool of expanding and diversifying what the Marine Corps can be as far as thinking goes.
Thank you. We're going to be to your left towards the very back again.
So in the run-up to the war, when the draft was proposed in 1940, I think it was, and they were talking about could blacks go to OCS when OCS was established, there was a great deal of anxiety that I've read about that they were afraid that white troops would not obey black officers. There was a concerted effort by black newspapers like the Amsterdam News and so forth. And did any of you study what effect those publications had on Marshall and Roosevelt in terms of trying to deal with a more equitable solution to black soldiers?
You got that one.
I didn't quite understand it.
So how did the newspapers influence if there would be an equitable solution given executive decision-making with Roosevelt and people like Marshall?
Everything that President Roosevelt did or said or executed was monitored very closely with the black press at the time. Mostly the black press were concentrated on the East Coast and some parts of the South, not so much the West. They were very careful and keen to monitor what he said and did to ensure that his directives, his executive orders, benefit blacks in general. I hope I'm on the right track answering this question. If I'm not, perhaps you can clarify it a little better.
What I thought I heard was something about the reluctance to have blacks go through OCS, Officer Candidate School, because they didn't want them commanding white troops. Well, that wasn't going to happen. They didn't want black officers, period, in World War II. As Major General Gravett stated, there were 5 black officers in World War II at the beginning. 3 were chaplains and 2 were the line officers, Benjamin O. Davis Sr. and his son, Benjamin O. Davis Jr., who would command the Tuskegee Airmen. And his father didn't have any command over any troops in World War II. He was put in a position, basically, I guess staff or something, in which he had no authority over others.
And so one of the things that we bring up is, remember, segregation is law at the time to the run-up to World War II, so that just wasn't going to happen because segregation was the law of the land at the time. And so you will never see a white troop under any black commander, whether it was an enlisted person or an officer. It just wasn't going to happen. With regard to newspapers, they did monitor the FDR very closely in what he would preach, especially during his fireside chats. But just because segregation was the law of the land, that just wasn't possible.
If I can cite a personal experience, when I went through Officer Candidate School, OCS, as we were about to graduate, the process was that the cadets would go before a board of 3 officers, and you previously identified what branches in the Army that you would like to serve in. And ideally, you would get your first or second choice, but it was the Army that decided what branch based upon their need for officers in that particular branch. My first choice was field artillery. My second choice was armor, tanks. And my third choice was infantry. I did not get any of those. The board indicated that I was, well, not officially to me, but overheard them discussing this, that I was a black officer and field artillery takes a lot of mathematical computations, and this officer probably lacks the ability to do math. Had he checked my record in front of him, he would have seen that I had a bachelor's degree at the time, and my major in college was criminalistics, which today is called crime scene investigation if you watch TV a lot, but which required a lot of mathematics. But I was not given those 3. I was given a support branch instead. It was only a year later, after I was in the field, that I was able to transfer from that branch into the armor branch, which I spent most of my career in.
Gentlemen, next question is to your far left, towards the front.
Excellent presentation. I have a question for each of you. Major General, can you tell us about the Medal of Honor winner who gets recognized 70 years later? And Dr. McCoy, my question for you is, what's the solution to get that next Colin Powell in the Marine Corps?
What's the solution to?
He's asking about Waverly Woodson. I'm sorry, okay. Reuben Rivers.
Reuben Rivers?
Yes.
Reuben Rivers was a unique soldier. He had served in the Army and was discharged, was a civilian for a while, then went back into the Army. And he honored himself in combat, and he was not awarded the Medal of Honor initially. And then after a lot of petitioning by his family and by others, his service to the military was recognized, and he received the Medal of Honor. But that was a good example of soldiers in World War II and later not being presented the award that their valor dictated. He eventually received the Medal of Honor, but there were others even after him that received the Medal of Honor years after World War II, even years after the Korean War.
Yeah, there was a study done that started out of Shaw University that the Department of Defense backed in 1994 during the Clinton administration, which led to the honoring of 7 black soldiers and officers for the Medal of Honor. And only one was still living at the time, and that was Vernon Baker from Texas. And some fascinating stories, especially the one of Fox, who called in artillery fire on his own position, basically to stave off the enemy in Italy. And yet, in World War II, the 92nd Division was also characterized as cowardly, that they, ran from battle, and they had terrible leadership. No one points to that, and of course those leaders were white officers who actually wanted those troops to fail in a self-fulfilling prophecy. I think we have time for one more question.
Yeah, and an aside from what Dr. Sammons just said, we're honored to have Edward Carter's Medal of Honor in our Arsenal of Democracy exhibit. We're going to go one last question to your left, gentlemen.
I'm a retired Navy captain, and but parenthetically had the opportunity to work for General Powell when he was chairman. But I'm now chairman of the USS Indianapolis Legacy Organization. And of course, the Navy is not faultless in this conversation. 1940, Secretary of the Navy Frank Knox said, "It is no kindness to Negroes to trust them upon men of the white race." On the USS Indianapolis, there were 28 African Americans. Not one of them survived the sinking. Of course, they were all restricted to ratings of either cook or steward. And we finally collected their stories in a book called Heroes in the Shadows. But my question is, the same Secretary Knox, it seemed, had different policies for African Americans who were in the Navy and in the Marine Corps. Is that true, and can you elaborate on that, if it is?
Well, the policies were exactly the same. The Marine Corps is a department of the Navy. As you know this, you probably will remind me after this panel, but the policies were exactly the same. But what was rare about the Marine Corps is it was just left on an island. And because at the time, General Thomas Holcomb, who was Commandant in the Marine Corps in the 1940s, who's also listed as modernizing the Marine Corps, he really was left alone because he did everything that was in line with societal values and what the status quo was. So no one ever challenged him on what he was doing because it was all directly in line with the legislation of the United States at the time. So, I mean, if anything else, he was, silently praised for ensuring that his elite institution, his beloved Marine Corps, would hold on to tradition.
Ladies and gentlemen, a round of applause for our panelists, Dr. Jeffrey Sammons, General Peter Gravett, and Dr. Cameron McCoy. Thank